So now we're going to write the code for our pivot function. So first I'm going to bring up a list like this. We'll represent it like this. And we'll shrink that down into the corner. So one of the things about this function is we have two different places where we need to swap items inside of the list. And we would swap those items with something like this. But since we're doing it twice, I'm going to create a function called swap so we don't have to rewrite this code. And we're going to use this in two different places in our pivot function. And that will just clean things up a bit. So let's get into the pivot function itself. So we're going to pass this a list, but we also need to give it the pivot index and the end index. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to pass it the first index of 0 and the end index, which is going to be 6. So we have 7 items here, and it'll be 0 through 6. So we've already created our first variable up here, pivot index, and that's going to point here. Our next variable, swap index, will just set that equal to the pivot index, like this. And then that variable I was part of our for loop. We'll bring that in. For I in range, and it's going to need the pivot index and the end index for this for loop. So I is going to start out at pivot index plus 1. That's going to put it here. And then here we say end index plus 1. And remember, the reason for that is the for loop is going to go up to but not including this value. And that's why we need to add the plus 1. So then we're going to compare that first value of I to the pivot value. So we'll say if my list at the index of I is less than my list at the pivot index, well, in this case, it's not less than. So I'm not going to fill out this if statement yet. What I'm going to do is color that value in gray. And then we'll run through the for loop again, which moves I over 1. So now this if statement is true. So now there are two things that we want to do. We want to move that swap index over 1. We'll do that like this, swap index plus equals 1, and that moves that over. And then we want to swap the items at I and at swap index. So we'll do that like this. This is that function that we created at the beginning of the video. We'll pass it the list, the swap index, and I, and it will swap those two items. Now, if we continue running this for loop all the way to the end, our list is going to look like this. Now what we need to do is swap the items at pivot index and swap index. And to do that, we're going to use that function again that we created at the beginning where we swap two items. We'll just swap the items at pivot index and swap index, and that will do this. Now the only thing left to do is return the swap index. So I want to emphasize here, we're not returning the value of 4 here. We're returning the index of 3. So the pivot function does two things. It's going to rearrange the items in your list so they'll look like this, and it will also return the swap index. So we'll look at this code in a moment in VS Code, and when we get done running it, our list is going to look like this with 4 in the middle. All the items that are less than will be on the left. Everything that's greater than the 4 will be on the right. But we're going to start the list out looking like this. All right, so now let's flip over to VS Code. So there is our swap function there that just takes 2 items in the list and exchanges them. Here's our pivot function. And then down here, we've created a list called myList. This is the list that we just looked at. And then we're going to run pivot on myList. And then the pivot index is going to be 0. That's the first item in the list. And then the end index in the list is going to be at the index of 6. Okay, so I'll run this. And remember, the only thing this returns is the swap index of 3. But we also want to make sure that our list has been rearranged the way we want it to be rearranged. So we're going to come down here and paste this in where we print my list after we run pivot. So I'll run this again. And you can see here that 4 is in the middle, and all the items that are less than 4 are on the left, and all the items that are greater than 4 are on the right. All right, so that is our function for pivot.